Hello and welcome to the Jaggy Thistle podcast. My name's Kenny Farquharson. I'm your host for these wee chats, wee fireside chats. Not fireside. I'm not nowhere near a fire. These little chats from my study in Edinburgh on Scottish politics and Scottish culture. And since the last time we spoke, I've had a complaint that somebody said that they can hear in the background the ticking of a clock. And it's true. You listen to it. Here we go. Can you hear that? That's my old wag at the wall clock in my study in Edinburgh. And so I had to make a decision. Do I stop the clock every time I do a podcast, or do I carry on regardless and have that in the background, annoying some listeners, but maybe charming other listeners? Who the hell knows? Let me know if you like it or you don't like it, and I'll maybe have to make a decision about that at some stage in the future. Anyway, with the ticking of a clock, let's get on with things. Today I'm going to talk to you about Nicola Sturgeon again. Still lots from her memoir that I think is illuminating and telling about Scottish politics, and I want to focus on one of those things today. We're going to talk about her. We're going to talk about emotional intelligence and politics, and we're going to talk about the most stupid idea in Scottish nationalism. Now, there we are. In fact, there's more than one stupid idea in Scottish nationalism, and we might touch on that one, on a couple of them actually this morning. So let's see how we get on. But the moment I want to focus in on the Sturgeon book is where I think there was a flaw and a failure of her famed emotional intelligence. Many years ago, I actually had a conversation with Sturgeon about this subject, and I can't remember exactly what the reason was, but somebody in politics had been doing something really stupid, and I was speaking to her in Holyrood, and we agreed that emotional intelligence, which there'd been a distinct lack of in this incident, was the key attribute, the key skill in frontline politics. Actually in journalism as well, but in politics particularly, the ability to read people and understand people's motivations and then anticipate what they might be doing next, and to kind of understand them at a kind of emotional level, sometimes in a way that they barely understand themselves. And we agreed that was the key skill in a politician, and perhaps one that wasn't fully recognised in female politicians or acknowledged in female politicians, because political historians and political commentators are generally male, and they tend to emphasise what they see as the manly virtues of great political leaders. Anyway, so that's a little bit of a background that this Sturgeon has always prided herself on her emotional intelligence. It was pretty, it came to the fore during the COVID saga in terms of how she communicated with people and understood people's anxieties and how she dealt with that. I think even her opponents, some of them anyway, recognise she did that quite well. But there's a moment in Sturgeon's biography, in her memoir, that is very telling, because it shows a flaw in her emotional intelligence, and it's where she's talking about the way that the SNP and the Scottish government dealt with the Brexit referendum, and her view was that this had to be the trigger for a new referendum on Scottish independence. And she talks in the book how that she recognised there was like a third of Scottish opinion that was solidly unionist, solidly pro UK, and a third that was solidly nationalist and pro independence. But she felt that the middle third were now persuadable in the light of Brexit. And she admits she got this wrong, because what she thought that they would be energized by Brexit and kind of so angry about it that they would be they'd want to re-engage in politics, take it up a notch and take it further. And she admits that what she didn't recognise was that people were tired of political upheaval after the independence referendum, after the Brexit referendum. They just wanted peace and quiet. And she said that came as a shock to her, or not as a shock to her, but as a surprise to her. Now, if you think back to that time, anybody with eyes and ears could have told Nicola Sturgeon that that's how people were thinking. Okay, you know, the weariness in the population was palpable, and someone with emotional intelligence, she clearly has, should have picked that up. So why didn't she? She didn't, because she's a nationalist, and she has a nationalist mindset, and she looks at the world through nationalist eyes, and worse, she kind of assumes that people think the same way as she does. And they don't, okay? Your average Joe and Jean McPublic do not think like a committed career nationalist who's devoted their life to the cause of independence. That's just not how they think. But there is a kind of, there's a kind of assumption within Scottish nationalism, even at a very kind of senior, strategic, intelligent level, that just doesn't understand that normal people don't think like them. Okay, and you know, so there are conclusions to be drawn here, and you know, one of them is that Nats shouldn't try to think like Nats. You know, it's actually a political disadvantage to do that, because you're applying a mindset to people who don't have that mindset. And there's a kind of view that, you know, that within every single Scots person, there's a kind of wee gnat trying to get out, and all you got to do is call to that wee gnat and wait for it to answer the call, and people will emerge. And nowhere is this kind of more obvious than what I would call the most stupid idea in Scottish nationalist politics, which is the phrase which was coined around about the 2014 referendum, and it still gets used. You still get it thrown at you on social media, and it's a question. It says, "Are you yes yet?" Okay, you yes yet. You often get this on Twitter and elsewhere, and it's almost like a taunt. And the assumption that underlies it is that we're all on a kind of slippery slope to yes. All we need is a wee nudge, you know, because all we need is for the scales to fall from our eyes and to realise our inner gnat that's at the core of every single Scots person. And that's a kind of a bonkers way of thinking about politics when you think about it. No other political movement thinks like this. It's seen as perfectly normal within SNP and Yes circles and broadly national circles. If last year in the US presidential election, the Democrats had come up with a slogan that said, "Are you Dem yet?" People would have thought, what are you doing? What the fuck are you doing? You know, people don't have within them a kind of inner Democrat that's just waiting to kind of come out. And if during the Brexit referendum, even the Leave campaign, which was ultimately successful, if they'd have said, "Are you Leave yet?" assuming that within everybody was this kind of, nascent leaver who just needed to be encouraged to kind of, come out and accept their true nature as a leaver, then people would have thought you're daft. But that is the core emotional, psychological, political thinking that lies behind much of nationalist thought, and it's bonkers, really. I mean, it's a truism that politics is a battle of ideas. We accept that that's the case, but within Scottish nationalism, that's kind of frowned upon slightly, because this isn't just another political bun fight. This is about this is about your personal date with destiny as a person and as a nation. Okay, this is something more noble and honourable than just politics. So normal political rules don't apply. And I think that's mad. But even from, I mean, I'm not a nationalist, but even from a nationalist point of view, this is mad, because it's a break on the advancement of SNP as a party and the independence movement as a movement, because it fails to understand something about human nature, or it makes an assumption, a wrong assumption about people's human nature. And you know, this I think is something so deeply ingrained. It's very actually difficult for the party and for the movement to deal with. So, you know, Sturgeon in her book accepts that the idea of a de facto referendum on independence was, quotes, probably wrong. And, you know, the de facto referendum policy, I think, is a classic example of a failure of Sturgeon's emotional intelligence. It was an example of what I would call the kind of one more heave view of Scottish nationalists. And this idea, which has been around within SNP thinking for as long as I can remember. You remember when I started covering politics back in the early 90s, covering Scottish politics, the phrase that was very common, I think it was coined by Alex Neil, who's still with us, that Scotland would be free by 93. And that kind of one more heave, here we go. The SNP loves this. The SNP never saw a ditch it didn't want to die in. Okay, and it kind of sees the world in illuminated in the flickering light of this flame that is at the heart of their being. Okay, but you know that light, that flickering light, can be deceptive. It can tell you things. You can think things are there that aren't there, or you can see things in a way that isn't accurate and obscures their true nature. Getting a bit philosophical there, haven't I? Anyway, so you know, the Sturgeon accepts that this was wrong. Okay, Sturgeon now accepts that this was a misstep. So the question now, with that in black and white in our memoir, you know, okay, we tried this, guys, and it was wrong. And here's why it was wrong. It was because it was a failure of emotional intelligence, and it was a failure to kind of accept that people weren't ready for it, and it was a failure to accept what people were really thinking about themselves and their lives. It was a failure to understand how willing people were to take things to the next level in the battle for independence and throw themselves at this wall, because it is a wall, okay? We've talked in other podcasts, and we will in the future, about how you deal with basically a wall in a constitutional crisis, and then how you deal with that. You don't just fling yourself at it hoping the wall will crumble. So, you know, having set out all these kind of quite stark lessons for the nationalist movement and for the SNP in her memoir, will the SNP now learn those lessons? Okay, stand back from these insurgent policies like the de facto referendum, which Sturgeon accepted felt like a wildcat, unconstitutional tactic. Will the party stand back from that now and have a more reasoned, emotionally intelligent and sensible policy as it goes forward? And the answer is no. Because if you look at what's going to happen at the SNP conference in Aberdeen this autumn, it's shaping up to be a confrontation between Nicola Sturgeon's idea of a de facto referendum, a theory, as we've just said, disproved and disowned and accepted was wrong, and John Swinney's slightly more level-headed and sedate and rather more Swinney-esque approach, which is we will only regard a majority of SNP MSPs at Holyrood as a trigger for a referendum on independence, setting the bar quite high, deliberately high, I think. Now, we can go into, this is going to be something we'll get into in the autumn, the details around this, but the important thing I want to kind of stress just now is stand back from that and realize, look at that from kind of a wider angle and see it for what it is, which is a disproved theory which is redolent of the flaws of modern Scottish nationalism, being promoted by 40-odd branches of the SNP, and will be used to challenge the mainstream SNP view, the leadership view, which is a slightly more, in my view, not sensible enough, but slightly more sensible approach. How do you deal with this as the SNP leadership? One thing which I thought was clear right the way through the Sturgeon biography was how much of her strategizing was actually aimed at quelling the hotheads within her own party. It wasn't about the British state or even the Scottish people. It wasn't about dealing with the May or Johnson or Sunak or it wasn't about an understanding of where the Scottish people were and where they needed to get to. It was internal party management. Okay, and I think we underestimate just how much that's been a factor, a determining factor for SNP leaders over the last 10 years. And we're about to see a new phase of that. So we'll get to that at the time. We'll speak again many times between now and the autumn, and try and understand that better. But let's understand it for what it is. It's a kind of it's the SNP looking for a ditch to die in. It's a one more heave. It's free by there's no alliterative free by 93 equivalent at the moment, but I'm sure we'll find one. So that's my take today on the most stupid idea in Scottish politics. I'm sure you'll have views on this. Let me know. Put your comments in the boxes as appropriate, whether you're watching this or watching this on YouTube, or listening to it on Substack, or listening to it on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Wherever you're listening to it, please feel free to subscribe and for more of this in the future. And also have a look at the Jaggy Thistle Substack on the app or on the website. And if you feel that it's something you might like more of in the future, feel free to subscribe. Okay, thanks for listening, and we'll speak again soon. See ya.